The Kurds are one of the world's largest ethnic groups without a nation-state. Instead, they are spread across 4 Middle Eastern countries, being a significant minority in each one. This has left them vulnerable to the centralizing efforts of each government. Subsequently, Kurds across the region have complained about a lack of ability to express their cultural rights and autonomy. Not to mention, there have been several episodes of incredibly harsh repression against them. As a result, Kurdish resistance movements have cropped up throughout the last century, aiming to defend themselves and their cultural identity. The aims of these resistance movements have vacillated from outright independence to gaining greater autonomy. The Kurds inhabit a mountainous region in Western Asia, spanning southeastern Turkey, northwestern Iran, northern Iraq, and northern Syria. They have a long history that includes being the ethnicity of the famed Muslim medieval ruler Salahuddin Ayyubi. But our story begins in the immediate aftermath of World War I, a period which not only shaped the destiny of the Kurds, but much of the Middle East as we know it today. To get a general overview of the developments in the region during the interwar years, check out the video I did on the making of the modern Middle East. In the years before World War I, various ethnicities within the Ottoman Empire proclaimed their own nationalist visions, the Kurds being one of them. Once World War I finished and the Allies had to decide what to do with the Middle East, the President of America, Woodrow Wilson, drafted his famous 14 points, one of which stated that the nationalities living under the Ottoman Empire should be able to self-determine their future. To this day, Kurds reference Wilson's 14 points in their irredentis calls. Britain and France, however, had already discussed the splitting up of the region for their own benefit before the war was even over. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 aimed to split the Middle East into zones of influence. So when the war ended, the newly created League of Nations established the mandate power system, whereby France got Syria and Lebanon, whilst Britain got Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. The French and British were unwilling to sacrifice territory from their respective mandates of Syria and Iraq, so they decided to carve out a state for the Kurds in southeastern Anatolia in the Treaty of Sevres in 1920. However, by 1923, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk had led the Turkish national movement to victory in the Turkish War of Independence. As a result, the Turks were able to force the Allies back to the negotiating table and revise Sevres. The subsequent Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 made no provisions for the Kurds in any of the 4 Middle Eastern states. The borders of the newly established Republic of Turkey subsumed the intended state for the Kurds, leaving them in limbo. This did not stop the Kurds from trying to force the issue and carve out a state for themselves. Over the course of the next 3 decades, there would be 4 major attempts at establishing Kurdish sovereignty. Now let's have a closer look at the 4 countries they are a significant minority in. Right from the beginning, the Turkish government and its Kurdish citizens were at odds with one another. In the aftermath of the major Kurdish uprising known as the Sheikh Said Rebellion in 1925, The Inspectorates General were established by Ataturk. This meant that until 1952, the Kurdish-dominated provinces in the east and south were ruled by martial law. This was supplemented by a conscious effort from Ankara to Turkify all of its citizens. The Turkish government took extreme measures throughout the 20th century to ensure the complete Turkification of Kurds. The Kurdish language was banned. Students in school who spoke Kurdish were punished. Merchants were fined. President Evren of Turkey went as far to state that Kurds don't even exist, instead referring to them as Mountain Turks, and imaginatively claimed that the word Kurd came from the squelching sound snow made when you stepped in it. Up until 1965, foreigners were not allowed access to the southeastern portion of the country, so that Turkey's international reputation would not be harmed by its official maltreatment of the Kurds living in that region. The Kurds did not take all of this repression lying down. There were a number of large-scale revolts, such as the Dersim Rebellion in 1938. By the 1970s, Marxism had become a powerful influence among the younger generation of Kurdish activists. This led to the creation of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, better known as the PKK. Led by Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK initiated an insurgency against the Turkish government in 1984. The ensuing guerrilla war lasted throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. The conflict still continues to this day in some shape or another, despite several ceasefires. The conflict has claimed some 50,000 lives in the process. Like the Kurdish resistance movements in the other Middle Eastern states, the PKK's goals have vacillated between complete independence and gaining greater autonomy/representation for Kurds. Across the border to the south, Kurds in Iraq have experienced similar challenges to establishing local autonomy. A key parallel with Turkey is that the central government in Baghdad has dealt with the Kurds in a strong-handed and at times incredibly oppressive manner. Conflict between Baghdad and the Kurds in the northern areas has existed in some shape or another since the 1920s. Up until the 1970s, the resistance movement was dominated by Mustafa Barzani, leading multiple revolts across 5 decades. In fact, his family have a leading role in Kurdish politics today. His son and grandson have ruled the Kurdistan regional government officially since 2005. The Iraqi government and Iraqi Kurds have at times come close to somewhat resolving their issues. At the end of the first Iraqi-Kurdish war in 1970, the two sides sat down and announced a peace plan which would result in Kurdish autonomy and even representation in the government. This was to be implemented over 4 years. However, problems arose within the first few years. For instance, the Iraqi Ba'athist government embarked on an Arabization program similar to the one initiated by the Ba'athist Party in Syria roughly around the same time. Subsequently, the peace plan fell apart, and the Second Iraqi-Kurdish War began in 1974. The Kurds lost that war because in 1975, Iraq and Iran signed the Algiers Accord, according to which Iran would cut off supplies to the Kurds fighting Baghdad. This highlights a key theme in the Kurdish struggle for power: the fact that they are in some senses at the mercy of aid from outside actors. The 1980s proved to be an especially dark period for Iraqi Kurds. In the backdrop of the Iran-Iraq War, the Iraqi Kurds waged war against Saddam Hussein's government. In turn, the dictator took drastic measures to beat the fight out of the Kurdish resistance. The notorious Al-Anfal campaign saw the destruction of thousands of Kurdish villages and the death of up to 180,000 Kurds, with a few countries officially recognizing it as a genocide. Eventually, by 1991, this forced the international community, led by the United States, to implement the Iraqi no-fly zones. This allowed the Kurds to exercise self-governance and autonomy, establishing the Kurdistan regional government. It is important to mention that even though I have been using the term Kurd as a homogeneous ethnic label, Kurds do suffer from divisions within. In the mid-1990s, the two major Kurdish parties in Iraq, the KDP and the PUK, engaged in a civil war which led to a division of the Kurdistan region of northern Iraq. Even in the wake of the US invasion in 2003, the rivalry between the Talabani family-led PUK and the Barzani family-led KDP has threatened the stability of Iraqi Kurdistan on multiple occasions. Regardless, Iraqi Kurds are closer now than ever to achieving a dream scenario of independence. The conflict against ISIS resulted in an enlargement of Kurdish authority because of the leading role that the Kurdish Peshmerga forces played in defeating the extremist group. Due to the conflict, their control expanded further, including the contested oil-rich city of Kirkuk. In 2017, the KRG even felt emboldened enough to launch a referendum inquiring whether Kurdistan should be independent or not, and 92% of the votes were in favor of independence. The Iraqi government promptly shot down any prospect of that happening, however, and used military force to remove the Kurdish presence from the city of Kirkuk. The French settled the Syrian border with Turkey largely along the Berlin-Baghdad railway line. This cut across the Kurdish community. Out of the 4 Middle Eastern states, Syria has the smallest Kurdish presence, and throughout much of Syrian history, the ethnic group was unable to exert any real authority or resistance. But this changed due to developments Serhat, or above the line as Kurds call the border with Turkey. The PKK's insurgency in southeastern Turkey from the early 1980s onwards saw a migration of insurgents and political activists fleeing to the relative safety of Bin Khat, or below the line, to Syria. Sometimes this was done with the encouragement of the government in Damascus. This highlights another pivotal theme in Kurdish political history, that they have been repeatedly used by regional powers for their own aims and goals. PKK militants would even use northern Syria as a base from which to attack Turkey. Consequently, this would lead to Syrian Kurds becoming even more politicized. We can still see the link today if we consider that the PYD, the leading Syrian Kurdish party, is heavily influenced by and may even have grown out of the PKK. Turkey even got involved in the recent Syrian civil war, largely due to concerns of rising Kurdish power inside of Syria, potentially destabilizing an already unstable security situation in Turkish Kurdistan. Nonetheless, Kurds have never had more autonomy than they do now. From the melee of the Syrian civil war, the Kurds have managed to establish and maintain a de facto autonomous region. The autonomous administration of North and East Syria in the northeastern pocket of the country is also referred to as Rojava, the label used by Kurds for West Kurdistan. Out of these 4 nation-states they inhabit, one could argue that the Kurdish experience in Iran has been the least uncomfortable over the last century. This can partially be attributed to the fact that there are stronger ethno-linguistic and historical ties between Kurds and other Iranian peoples. Therefore, Iranian nationalism was not so antagonistic to the Kurds in comparison to Turkish or Arab nationalism. Nevertheless, this does not mean there has been no tension between the government and the Kurds, who mainly reside in the West. From 1921 until 1979, the Pahlavi dynasty was determined to centralize as much authority as possible. On top of that, in a similar fashion to Ataturk's Turkey, the Iranian government sought to impose a uniform national identity on the various ethnicities and cultures within the country. The toppling of the Shah in the Islamic Revolution of 1979 initially gave hope to Iranian Kurdish resistance groups. But their relationship with Ayatollah Khomeini's newly established government soon turned sour. Similar to the Pahlavis, the Islamic Republic has viewed the nationalist aspirations of ethnic minorities with a distrust, stating that the notion of nationalism undermines wider Islamic unity. For the most part, Kurdish resistance in Iran has revolved around gaining greater autonomy from the capital, Tehran. In summary, even though the Kurds have experienced attempts to Arabize them in Syria and Iraq, attempts to Turkify them in Turkey, and attempts from both the Shahs and Ayatollahs to limit their autonomy in Iran, they are still fighting for what they consider to be their right to assert themselves culturally and politically in the region they inhabit. As usual, big thank you to my patrons for being awesome and generous, especially the newest one, Gabriel. If you want to support the channel, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video. Until next time, peace.